On the morning of April 18, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room of the Combined Fleet Headquarters at Hashirajima Anchorage, reading an intelligence summary that should have been impossible. American carrier aircraft had just bombed Tokyo. The report detailed 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, striking the capital and other cities across Honshu. The planes had come from somewhere in the Pacific, launched from a carrier task force that had penetrated to within 600 miles of Japan's home islands, struck, and withdrawn before Japanese forces could intercept them. Yamamoto had spent the previous 5 months carefully reviewing Japan's strategic position, following the attack on Pearl Harbor. His staff had compiled comprehensive assessments of American industrial capacity, shipbuilding programs, and naval construction timelines. The numbers in those reports told a story that deeply troubled him, but one that few other senior officers seemed willing to fully acknowledge. Japan had achieved stunning victories across the Pacific. The Imperial Navy had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire now controlled resources and territory that planners had only dreamed of a year earlier. But Yamamoto understood something that the celebrations and victory parades obscured. Japan had not actually reduced American naval power in any meaningful long-term sense. The ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were old battleships, many dating from the First World War. The American carrier fleet, the actual center of naval power in the Pacific, remained largely intact. And behind those carriers stood something far more dangerous than any single ship or fleet: American industrial capacity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Doolittle Raid, as it would become known, was tactically insignificant. 16 bombers dropping small bomb loads on Japanese cities caused minimal physical damage. But the raid revealed something that confirmed Yamamoto's deepest concerns. The United States Navy, supposedly crippled by Pearl Harbor, had already reorganized, redeployed, and launched offensive operations deep into waters Japan considered secure. If America could project power like this just 4 months after suffering its worst naval defeat in history, what would they be capable of in a year? In 2 years? Yamamoto had tried to communicate these concerns before the war began. In private conversations with senior government officials, he had warned that Japan might achieve victories for 6 months, perhaps a year, but he had no confidence in success beyond that timeline. The statement was not pessimism, it was mathematics. Japan's entire annual steel production was approximately 6 million tons. American steel production was 80 million tons annually. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, concentrated in major yards at Kure, Yokosuka, Nagasaki, and Sasebo, could build perhaps 300,000 tons of warships per year when operating at maximum capacity. American shipyards could build millions of tons. These numbers meant that any extended war would inevitably favor the United States. Japan could win battles, could sink American ships, could seize territory. But unless the war ended quickly with a negotiated peace that left Japan's conquests intact, America's industrial base would simply overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer production capacity. This was the strategic reality that Yamamoto understood, and that the Doolittle Raid, in its small way, demonstrated. The United States was not defeated. It was preparing. The roots of this industrial disparity stretched back decades to decisions made in Tokyo during a very different era. In 1918, as the First World War ended, Japan's naval planners looked at the world order and recognized both opportunity and threat. The war had devastated European powers. Britain, while victorious, had exhausted its treasury and lost much of its naval supremacy. Germany's fleet had been scuttled at Scapa Flow. France and Italy faced reconstruction. Russia had collapsed into revolution. This left 3 major naval powers positioned to dominate the Pacific: Britain, the United States, and Japan. Japanese naval strategists, particularly those who had studied at the Naval War College in Tokyo, developed a comprehensive doctrine for how Japan could secure its position as the dominant Pacific power. The plan was called the 8-8 Fleet Program. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Japan would build and maintain a battle fleet consisting of 8 modern battleships and 8 battlecruisers, all less than 8 years old. This force would be sufficient to defeat any likely opponent in the Pacific, particularly the United States Asiatic Fleet, and would deter aggression by making any attack on Japanese interests prohibitively costly. The program represented an enormous commitment of resources. Battleships were the most expensive and complex weapons systems of their era, requiring years to build and consuming vast quantities of steel, specialized armor plate, heavy guns, fire control equipment, and propulsion systems. Each ship represented not just a hull, but an entire industrial ecosystem of suppliers, contractors, and skilled workers. Japanese naval architects had proven their competence during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, when Japan's fleet destroyed Russian naval forces at Tsushima. That victory had announced Japan as a modern naval power. The 8-8 fleet program would confirm it. The first ships of the program, the Nagato-class battleships Nagato and Mutsu, were extraordinary achievements. Laid down in 1917 and 1918 respectively, these ships displaced 42,000 tons, fully loaded and mounted 8 16-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. They were fast, capable of 26 knots, and heavily armored with 12 inches of belt armor protecting their vital spaces. When Nagato completed in 1920, she was among the most powerful warships in the world. Japanese naval planners had every reason for confidence. But the 8-8 fleet program represented a fundamental miscalculation about what was politically and economically sustainable. The cost was staggering. Initial estimates suggested the program would consume 1/3 of Japan's entire national budget for years. This was not sustainable for a nation still industrializing, still building its infrastructure, still modernizing its economy. More importantly, the program triggered exactly the response it was meant to deter: American concern and American building programs designed to maintain naval superiority. The United States Congress, watching Japanese construction with increasing alarm, authorized its own battleship programs. The collision between Japanese naval ambitions and American industrial capacity came not in battle, but in a conference room in Washington, D.C. In November 1921, representatives from the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy gathered for the Washington Naval Conference. The stated goal was arms limitation, reducing the naval competition that threatened to bankrupt all participants. The actual goal, from the American and British perspectives, was to constrain Japanese naval expansion while preserving Western superiority. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes opened the conference with a proposal that stunned the Japanese delegation. Hughes proposed that the United States, Britain, and Japan accept a ratio of capital ship tonnage at 5:5:3. For every 5 tons of battleships and battlecruisers that America or Britain built, Japan would be limited to 3 tons. The ratio would be locked in through a 10-year building holiday, during which no new capital ships would be constructed. Existing ships beyond the treaty limits would be scrapped. For Japanese naval planners, this proposal was catastrophic. The 3/5 ratio meant Japan could never achieve the 8-8 fleet. Instead of 16 capital ships, Japan would be limited to approximately 10 ships totaling 300,000 tons. The United States would be allowed approximately 500,000 tons. Britain would receive the same. The careful calculations, the industrial investments, the strategic planning behind the 8-8 fleet program, all of it became irrelevant. Japanese delegates argued passionately against the ratio. They pointed out that Japan faced only one potential adversary in the Pacific, the United States, while America had to consider both Atlantic and Pacific deployments. They argued that a 3/5 ratio left Japan vulnerable, unable to defend its legitimate interests. They proposed alternative ratios, 10:10:7, or at minimum 10:10:6. American and British delegates refused. The ratio would be 5:5:3, or there would be no treaty. The Japanese government faced an impossible choice: reject the treaty and continue building, which would trigger an arms race Japan could not win, or accept the treaty, accept permanent inferiority in capital ship tonnage, and hope that qualitative advantages, better training, and superior tactics could compensate for numerical disadvantage. After bitter internal debates, including threats of resignation from senior naval officers, Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty in February 1922. The treaty fundamentally reshaped Japanese naval strategy. If Japan could not match American numbers in battleships, then Japan would have to emphasize quality, building ships that were individually superior to their American counterparts. Japanese naval architects would push the boundaries of treaty limitations, designing ships that nominally complied with tonnage restrictions but actually displaced far more through creative accounting and outright deception. The culture of excellence, of technical sophistication, of doing more with less, this became central to Japanese naval identity. It had to, because the alternative was acknowledging that Japan had already lost the arms race before it truly began. The Washington Naval Treaty remained in force through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, constraining battleship construction across all signatory nations. But the treaty system began crumbling in the mid-1930s as international tensions increased and nations sought strategic advantages. Japan formally withdrew from the treaty system in December 1934, effective 1936. This withdrawal freed Japanese naval planners to resume capital ship construction without treaty restrictions on numbers or tonnage. The result was the Yamato-class battleship program, perhaps the ultimate expression of Japan's qualitative approach to naval warfare. If Japan could not build more battleships than America, then Japan would build battleships so powerful that each individual ship would be worth 2 or 3 American counterparts. The design specifications were extraordinary. Yamato and her sister ship Musashi would displace 72,000 tons fully loaded, making them the heaviest battleships ever constructed. They would mount 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever put to sea, capable of firing 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells over 26 miles. The armor protection was equally impressive. The main belt was 16 inches thick, the turret faces 26 inches, the deck armor 8 inches with additional splinter protection. Japanese designers calculated that Yamato could withstand hits from any gun afloat, while her own weapons could penetrate any enemy armor at ranges where enemy ships could not effectively return fire. Construction began at Kure Naval Arsenal in November 1937, under conditions of extreme secrecy. The entire building slip was covered with rope screens and camouflage netting to prevent foreign intelligence from observing the ship's massive size. Workers were required to sign secrecy oaths. Even within the Japanese Navy, details of the Yamato-class specifications were restricted to a small number of senior officers. The ships represented a colossal investment. Each Yamato-class battleship consumed approximately 150,000 tons of steel during construction, roughly equal to Japan's entire monthly steel production. The shipyard facilities had to be specially enlarged to accommodate the hulls. New cranes, new slipways, new armor plate rolling mills, all had to be constructed. The cost per ship approached 140 million yen, equivalent to approximately 40 million US dollars at 1940 exchange rates. For comparison, an American Iowa-class battleship cost approximately $110 million to build, but the Iowa-class ships were smaller, displacing 57,000 tons fully loaded compared to Yamato's 72,000 tons. Japanese naval planners watched American responses to their withdrawal from treaty limitations with careful attention. Initial American reactions seemed to validate the qualitative approach. The United States did resume battleship construction, authorizing the North Carolina-class and South Dakota-class ships in the late 1930s. But these were treaty-influenced designs, nominally displacing 35,000 tons with 16-inch guns, smaller than what Japan was building. Intelligence reports suggested American designers were constrained by the need to transit the Panama Canal, which limited beam to 108 feet, which in turn limited displacement and armor protection. Japan appeared to have achieved a significant advantage. By building beyond treaty restrictions, while American designs remained influenced by treaty thinking and canal limitations, Japan would field a smaller number of individually superior ships. Combined with superior training, superior night fighting tactics, and the qualitative edge of the long lance torpedo that outranged anything in American service, Japanese planners believed they had found a workable solution to the industrial capacity problem. Quality would compensate for quantity. This belief was about to be tested against reality in a way that would reveal just how badly Japanese strategists had misread American capabilities. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, inflicted devastating tactical losses on the United States Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. More than 2,000 American servicemen were killed. The immediate military effect was to temporarily cede control of the Western Pacific to Japan, enabling the rapid Japanese conquests of the following months. But the attack had a second effect that Japanese planners had not fully anticipated. It unified American political will and triggered a massive industrial mobilization that would fundamentally transform American military capacity. In the 18 months following Pearl Harbor, American shipyards achieved production rates that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. The numbers were not classified or hidden. They were published in newspapers, reported in industrial journals, tracked by military planners on both sides. But the sheer scale made them difficult to fully comprehend until they translated into actual ships appearing in the Pacific. Consider the Essex-class aircraft carrier program. These were large fleet carriers, each displacing 36,000 tons fully loaded, capable of operating 90 to 100 aircraft, with sufficient speed and range to operate across the Pacific. The first ship, USS Essex, was laid down in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned in December 1942, just 13 months after the attack. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned. By the end of 1944, the number reached 17. By war's end in August 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers had been completed with more under construction. Japan, by comparison, commissioned 6 fleet carriers during the entire war, and most of those were conversions of existing hulls rather than purpose-built carriers. The disparity extended beyond carriers to every category of warship. American shipyards delivered 175 destroyers during the war. Japan completed 63 destroyers and destroyer escorts combined. American yards built 203 submarines. Japan built 126 submarines, many of which were smaller coastal types rather than fleet submarines. The production rates accelerated as the war continued. In 1943, American shipyards delivered approximately 2 million tons of naval vessels. In 1944, production reached nearly 3 million tons. Japanese production peaked at approximately 300,000 tons annually. But these aggregate numbers, while striking, still don't capture the full reality of what American industry achieved. It's in the specific stories of individual shipyards and production innovations that the true scale becomes apparent. Consider the Kaiser shipyards, a network of yards on the West Coast that specialized in building Liberty ships and escort carriers using prefabricated construction methods. These yards treated shipbuilding like automobile assembly, breaking the construction process into standardized modules that could be built simultaneously and then welded together. The Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California set a record in November 1942 by completing the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launching. This was a publicity stunt, not a sustainable pace, but it demonstrated what was theoretically possible. More importantly, it showed that American industry was thinking about shipbuilding in fundamentally different ways than traditional naval construction. Mass production methods, standardization, welding instead of riveting, prefabrication, all of these innovations increased output while reducing construction time and labor requirements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Escort carriers, smaller carriers built on merchant ship hulls, could be completed in as little as 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. American yards delivered 78 escort carriers during the war. These were not fleet carriers capable of engaging in major battles, but they were sufficient for convoy protection, submarine warfare, and ground support operations. Each one represented additional air power, additional logistics capacity, additional flexibility in how the Navy could deploy its forces. Japan built 4 escort carriers during the entire war. By mid-1943, Japanese naval planners were receiving intelligence reports that should have been alarming but somehow failed to trigger the fundamental strategic reassessment that circumstances demanded. American carrier task forces were operating with impunity across the Pacific, launching raids on Japanese-held islands, interdicting supply lines, and supporting amphibious invasions. Each engagement revealed more American ships than had been observed in previous operations. Intelligence analysts tracking American fleet composition noted something disturbing. Losses inflicted on American forces were being replaced faster than Japan could sink ships. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the clearest demonstration of this disparity. The Japanese mobile fleet, concentrated for a decisive engagement, sortied with 9 carriers including fleet carriers, light carriers, and converted battleship carriers. The American Fifth Fleet opposing them included 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers of the Essex class, and 8 light carriers. The qualitative advantage Japan had sought through superior individual ship design had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. American task forces could absorb damage, lose ships, and continue operating because replacement carriers were already en route from West Coast shipyards. The battle itself became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided aerial combat in which American fighters shot down Japanese aircraft at ratios approaching 10-1. But beyond the immediate tactical outcome, the battle revealed something about industrial capacity that was far more strategically significant. The Japanese mobile fleet committed approximately 430 aircraft to the battle. Approximately 330 were destroyed. These losses represented not just aircraft, but trained pilots, maintenance crews, and operational capacity that could not be quickly replaced. Japan's aircraft production, though substantial, could not keep pace with losses, while simultaneously training new pilots to replace casualties. American forces lost approximately 123 aircraft during the battle, but these losses barely affected operational capacity. Replacement aircraft were already in the logistics pipeline. New pilots were graduating from training programs at rates that exceeded losses. The American task forces that fought at the Philippine Sea could absorb these casualties and return to full strength within weeks. The Japanese mobile fleet required months to reconstitute its air groups, and even then could not replace the experienced pilots who had been lost. This pattern repeated across every category of military production. American submarine construction proceeded at rates that allowed the Navy to maintain aggressive patrol schedules despite losses to Japanese anti-submarine warfare. By war's end, the United States had over 200 submarines operating in the Pacific, strangling Japanese merchant, shipping, and cutting off the home islands from the resources of the Southern Empire. Japan's merchant fleet, essential for transporting oil from the East Indies and raw materials from conquered territories, shrank steadily throughout the war. Ships were sunk faster than replacements could be built. By 1945, Japan was effectively isolated, unable to bring resources from its empire to the industrial centers that needed them. The disparity even extended to ammunition production. American factories produced sufficient naval, artillery shells that ships could conduct, shore bombardments lasting hours or even days without concern for ammunition conservation. Japanese ships operated under constant ammunition constraints, required to carefully husband their shells because replacement supplies were limited. This affected tactical decisions, reduced training opportunities, and created a psychological burden on crews who knew they could not afford to waste ammunition on marginal targets. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see the full consequences of the industrial disparity he had warned about. He was killed in April 1943 when American P-38 fighters, acting on decoded intelligence, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. but his successors in the combined fleet headquarters watched the strategic situation deteriorate in exactly the way he had predicted. By late 1944, the mathematics of attrition had become undeniable. Japan was losing the war, not through any single, catastrophic defeat, but through the steady accumulation of losses that could not be replaced, facing an enemy whose losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. The loss of the Marianas in summer 1944 brought American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The loss of the Philippines in late 1944 and early 1945 cut Japan off from oil supplies in the East Indies. The loss of Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa by June provided forward bases for the invasion of Japan itself. At each stage, Japanese forces fought with skill and determination, often inflicting casualties at rates of 3 or 4 to 1. But the Americans could afford those casualties. Japan could not. The Imperial Navy that had begun the war with 10 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, and the confidence born of decades of professional excellence ended the war as a spent force. Yamato was sunk in April 1945 during a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, attacked by nearly 400 American carrier aircraft and sent to the bottom with most of her crew. Her sister Musashi had been sunk 6 months earlier at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, overwhelmed by torpedo and bomb hits from multiple American carrier air groups. The super battleships that were supposed to provide qualitative advantage had been neutralized by American air power and American numbers. The qualitative approach to naval warfare, the emphasis on building superior individual ships to compensate for numerical inferiority, had failed completely. Not because Japanese ships were poorly designed or because Japanese crews were inadequately trained, but because the entire premise was flawed. In industrial warfare between modern nations, quantity has a quality all its own. Superior training and superior equipment provide advantages, but they cannot overcome 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 disparities in production. The mathematics are unforgiving. Japanese naval officers who survived the war and later wrote their memoirs consistently returned to this theme. They had known, intellectually, that American industrial capacity was greater than Japan's. They had seen the statistics, had read the intelligence assessments, had understood the numbers. But understanding numbers in a briefing room is different from experiencing their consequences in combat. It was one thing to know that America could build more ships. It was another thing entirely to watch American task forces appear with more carriers than intelligence had predicted existed, to see damaged American ships replaced within weeks, to realize that every engagement was grinding down Japanese strength against an opponent who grew stronger with each passing month. Captain Tamechi Hara, who commanded destroyers throughout the war and survived, wrote in his post-war memoir that the moment he truly understood Japan would lose came not during any particular battle, but during a quiet moment in 1944 when he was reviewing casualty reports and replacement schedules. He realized that his destroyer division had been fighting for 3 years and had received exactly 2 replacement ships for vessels lost. Meanwhile, American destroyer divisions he encountered seemed to have fresh ships and fresh crews constantly joining them. The war had become a contest of industrial endurance, and Japan had entered that contest with inadequate resources. The strategic decisions made in the 1920s and 1930s, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time based on available information and political constraints, had locked Japan into an unwinnable position by 1941. The withdrawal from the Washington Naval Treaty System, the construction of the Yamato-class battleships, the emphasis on qualitative superiority, all of these were rational responses to the constraints Japan faced. But they were responses to the wrong problem. The problem was not how to build better individual ships. The problem was how to compete with an industrial base 20 times larger while fighting a war that would inevitably become a contest of production capacity. Some Japanese planners recognized this before the war began. Yamamoto's famous statement that he could run wild for 6 months, but had no confidence beyond that, was not defeatism. It was clear-eyed assessment of material realities. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, told Emperor Hirohito before the attack on Pearl Harbor that Japan's chances of victory decreased the longer the war continued and that Japan's best outcome was a short war ending in negotiated settlement. These warnings were overridden by political imperatives and by more optimistic assessments from officers who believed Japanese fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. The carrier battles of 1942, Coral Sea and Midway, demonstrated what industrial capacity meant in practical terms. At Coral Sea in May, Japan lost 1 light carrier sunk and 1 fleet carrier damaged. The United States lost 1 fleet carrier sunk and 1 damaged. The exchange ratio was roughly even, perhaps slightly in Japan's favor. But Coral Sea was a strategic defeat for Japan because the operation to seize Port Moresby was turned back. More importantly, the damaged Japanese carrier Shokaku required months of repairs and could not participate in the Midway operation a month later. The damaged American carrier Yorktown was patched up in 3 days at Pearl Harbor and fought at Midway. At Midway in June, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The United States lost 1. This was catastrophic for Japan, not just because of the immediate numerical loss, but because it took Japan 2 years to replace those 4 carriers with newly constructed ships. The United States had already authorized the Essex-class program before Midway and would commission the first Essex-class carrier within 7 months of the battle. By the time Japan had rebuilt its carrier force to pre-Midway strength in mid-1944, the United States had 15 fleet carriers in the Pacific, with more completing every month. The submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping demonstrated the same principle from a different angle. American submarines operated aggressively throughout the war, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By war's end, approximately 8.5 million tons had been sunk, far exceeding the starting tonnage because Japan was building replacement ships throughout the war. But Japanese shipyards could build approximately 300,000 tons of merchant shipping annually. American submarines were sinking over 1 million tons annually by 1943 and over 2 million tons in 1944. The mathematics were straightforward. Japan was losing merchant tonnage 3 times faster than it could be replaced. This meant that even if Japan had unlimited raw materials in its conquered territories, it could not transport those materials to the home islands where they were needed. Oil from the East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, all became increasingly difficult to transport as the merchant fleet shrank. By 1945, Japan was producing aircraft without sufficient fuel to train pilots adequately, building ships without sufficient steel, operating factories on reduced schedules because raw materials could not be delivered. The disparity extended to every aspect of the war effort. American factories produced 2 million trucks during the war. Japan produced 165,000 trucks. American aviation production reached 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japan produced 28,000 aircraft in 1944, its peak production year. American petroleum production was approximately 180 million tons annually. Japan, even with the oil fields of the East Indies, never produced more than 10 million tons annually, and by 1945 was producing almost nothing as transportation links were severed. The officers and sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who fought through to the war's end in August 1945, had watched their service systematically destroyed by an opponent who simply would not stop building ships. The final operations of the war, the kamikaze campaigns off Okinawa, and the desperate attempts to defend the home islands against invasion, were fought by a navy that had been reduced to a fraction of its 1941 strength. Most of the surviving ships were in port, unable to sortie because fuel was unavailable. Training programs had collapsed. New recruits received abbreviated instruction because experienced personnel had been killed, and fuel for training exercises was non-existent. The American Navy that accepted Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay in September 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the fleet that had been surprised at Pearl Harbor 45 months earlier. The battleships present at the surrender ceremony included new, fast battleships of the Iowa class, ships that had not existed when the war began. The carrier task forces included Essex-class carriers operating air groups of 100 aircraft each. Destroyer squadrons included ships fresh from American yards. The logistics train that supported this fleet, the oilers and ammunition ships and transports, represented an entirely separate industrial achievement, a fleet of support vessels that enabled American forces to operate indefinitely at distances thousands of miles from home ports. For Japanese observers at the surrender ceremony, the scene confirmed what the war had already taught. They had entered a conflict with an opponent who possessed industrial capacity so vast that Japan's best efforts could barely inconvenience it. The qualitative approach, the emphasis on superior individual ships and superior training, had been mathematically insufficient. Admiral Tomioka Sadatoshi, who served in the Naval General Staff throughout the war, wrote in his memoirs that Japan had fought the war it was prepared to fight, but America had fought a different kind of war entirely, one based on industrial mass production and material overwhelming superiority. The battleship race that Japan had lost was not the one fought in the 1920s under treaty restrictions. It was the race fought from 1941 to 1945, when both nations mobilized their full industrial capacity and the disparity in output became impossible to ignore. Japan had built the Yamato and Musashi, technical marvels that represented the peak of naval architecture. America had built 23 Essex-class carriers, 10 Iowa-class and South Dakota-class fast battleships, and 175 destroyers. Quality could not overcome that quantity gap. The lesson was harsh but clear. Industrial capacity determines outcomes in modern warfare between developed nations. Training, tactics, doctrine, morale, all of these matter and can provide temporary advantages. But sustained combat between industrial powers becomes a contest of production. And in that contest, the nation that can build more ships, produce more aircraft, manufacture more ammunition, and replace losses faster will eventually prevail. Japan had known this abstractly before the war. The war taught the lesson in the most definitive way possible, through defeat. The officers who planned the 8-8 fleet program in the 1920s had believed they were building a navy sufficient to secure Japan's position as a Pacific power. They had been rational in their planning, careful in their calculations, professional in their execution, but they had been operating under constraints that made victory impossible once the United States decided to mobilize its full industrial capacity. The battleships Japan built were excellent ships, well designed and well constructed. They were simply too few, built by a nation with too small an industrial base, to compete with an opponent that could build faster and more and with better logistics support. When Yamamoto stood in that operations room in April 1942 reading reports of the Doolittle Raid, he understood what many of his colleagues did not yet grasp. The raid was not important for its physical damage. It was important for what it revealed about American capability and American will. The nation that could launch such an operation just months after Pearl Harbor was not defeated, not deterred, and not lacking in industrial capacity to fight a long war. Japan had achieved its early victories. Now came the part of the war that Yamamoto had no confidence in, the part where industrial capacity would decide outcomes. The battleship race was already lost. It had been lost before the first shot was fired, lost in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the shipyards of Newport News, lost in the disparity between 6 million tons of steel production and 80 million tons, lost in the mathematics that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.